Hello, class. This may be a little bit of a long one today because there's a lot of material to cover, but I'm going to try to keep things as concise and as interesting as possible. It's just that this is a really big topic, but I'm hoping that by the end you'll have kind of a better understanding of where Dreiser's point of view comes from, especially how he views life in New York City. So in 1893, a financial panic that had been building actually for quite some time struck the United States. It was brought about by the collapse of the world's largest bank, which was Baring Brothers of England, a coup in Argentina, divestment in American securities on the part of European investors, and finally a run on US gold reserves. By the end of the year, 16,000 businesses were bankrupt, including companies controlling a third of the country's rail system. And the US had fallen into an economic depression that would last for 5 years. It would be the worst depression to hit the country until the Great Depression of the 1930s. Unemployment in non agricultural sectors rose as high as 20%, as did conflict between employers and their workers. Strikes across various industries broke out, only to be crushed by federal troops and state militias. This was an especially difficult time to be a resident of a city as the Depression hit industry much harder than it did agriculture. A contemporary survey of households in New York City found that 70,000 workers were unemployed and 20,000 were homeless. Conditions were so dire that foreign immigration to New York City, which had formerly been a major hub for immigrants from Europe, foreign immigration fell by over 80% over the course of 5 years. So, the purpose of today's lecture is to show how Dreiser's experience as a journalist during this period shaped the portrait of urban life that he paints in Sister Carrie. The goal here is to talk not only about the specific events that inspired the story, but the changing attitudes that informed it. And I'm talking here about changing attitudes toward the poor, influenced by the Depression and by what would come to be known as the Progressive Era in America, as well as changing standards for journalism, that it made it quite normal for a reporter who we tend to think of as someone who at least tries to write about objective facts. It became normal for a reporter to also begin writing fiction and to base his fiction even on his experiences as a reporter. Dreiser began working for newspapers in the early 1890s after attending Indiana University for 1 year without graduating. After working for various Midwestern newspapers, he arrived in New York City during the absolute depths of the Depression in 1894. Upon arrival, he took a rather miserable position as an unsalaried space rate reporter for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. This meant that he was paid only by the column inch, essentially how much he wrote or how much of his writing was published, and was sent out to report the absolute worst, most depressing stories. So, reporting on Bellevue Hospital, reporting on suicides, that kind of thing. The economic conditions of the city, as well as his rather low place in it, most likely influenced his overall view of New York, which he called gross, soggy, and even repulsive. If we compare this to his rapturous description of Chicago, you note that this is not just a comment on urban life in general. Of Chicago, he said, "How shall one hymn, let alone suggest, a city as great as this in spirit?" In particular, he was horrified by the extreme social inequality he saw in New York. So, in this quote from one of his memoirs, he said, "Nowhere before had I seen such a lavish show of wealth or such bitter poverty. In my reporting rounds, I soon came upon the East Side, the Bowery, with its endless lines of degraded and impossible lodging houses, a perfect whirl of bums and failures, the Brooklyn waterfront, part of it terrible in its degradation, and then by way of contrast again, the great hotels, the mansions along Fifth Avenue, the smart shops and clubs and churches." His journalism career didn't go particularly well at first. Earning just pennies at the New York World, Dreiser quit in 1895 and spent a period living kind of like Hearst would. He was sleeping in flop houses, running out of money, and he even began to contemplate suicide as he was nearly broke. He was saved by a stroke of luck. His brother Paul had become a composer and had recently made it big writing some hit popular songs. And he got Theodore a job as an editor at a new monthly magazine that was produced by his music company. This began the author's career writing not only for Every Month, which is what this magazine by the music company was called, but for many other popular magazines that were being produced at the time. His writing tended to concentrate on the socioeconomic extremes. So he got to interview Thomas Edison, the famous photographer Alfred Stieglitz, and the famous novelist William Dean Howells for a magazine literally called Success. But he also wrote about the poor whose labor he saw as supporting the lavish lifestyles of the rich and famous. So Dreiser would later use some of these stories as inspiration for characters and episodes in Sister Carrie, which was published in 1900. So he was working on this novel as he was also doing all this freelance magazine writing. So uh, chapter 45, Curious Shifts of the Poor, is inspired and in some parts copied verbatim from a story by the same title that he wrote for Demarest's in 1899. There's a copy of this in a PDF that I provided on Canvas. His reporting also inspired Hurstwood's experience as a scab during the trolley strike. When I mentioned this on Monday, I said that Dreiser reported on the Brooklyn trolley strike. I had misremembered this. I'm terribly sorry about that. So Dreiser was aware of this event, but he had actually reported on a similar streetcar strike during a brief sojourn as a reporter in Toledo, Ohio in 1894, so just the year prior. So, in writing that chapter of Sister Carrie, which is of course set in New York, Dreiser merged his own experience with the Toledo strike with the facts of the Brooklyn strike. So, this article is included in the PDF as well. The Brooklyn trolley strike was, according to historians, the most violent labor conflict in Brooklyn's history. Working conditions in the Brooklyn trolley lines had long been poor and unremunerative, meaning they didn't pay very much, as the companies who controlled them sought to pay shareholders as much as possible and were also seeking to pay off capital improvements that they had made through the electrification of the system. The trolleys were originally drawn by horses. Motormen and conductors declared a strike in January of 1895, demanding higher pay, safer conditions, and shorter working hours. This was aided in part by the nascent labor movement in New York, led by the Knights of Labor, who represented Brooklyn's trolleymen. Thanks to the ongoing depression, the companies, as you see in the novel, were able to find plenty of men desperate enough to keep the lines running. I'm triggering a conflict between strikers and their supporters on one side and the replacement workers and police on the other. And interestingly enough, the police at this time were led by Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, who would eventually become president of the United States. Strikers sabotaged the lines by cutting trolley wires, barricading the tracks, surrounding cars, and even attacking the replacement drivers, which is, of course, what we see in the book. Though the strike had the support of much of the public and even some of the police and even the Brooklyn City Council, then Mayor Sheeran called in the militia, which charged picket lines with bayonets, killing 2 people and wounding many more. So, as we discussed on Monday, Dreiser seems to have chosen to write about this particular incident and to borrow his own vivid observations from the Toledo strike because it is such a brutal demonstration of the conflict between capital and labor. And the way in which such conflicts set different parts of the working class, both the striking workers and the unemployed scabs, against one another. And this tells us something not only about the brutality of the conflicts, but also about a rising consciousness, especially among writers of these conditions. Like the 1930s, the 1890s made clear the failures of many parts of the American economic and political systems and inspired a lot of significant reform efforts. So the Depression years actually touched off what would come to be called the Progressive Era, which ran from roughly 1896 at the tail end of the Depression to 1916, the beginning of the First World War. And this was a period marked by reforms at almost every level of society, spurred by a growing concern for the plight of the poor and the power of corporations. So both at the national level and in New York, the Democratic Party, with its commitment to laissez-faire capitalism, was held responsible for the crisis, which led to a wave election that swept in many Republican reformers who attempted, with varying degrees of success, to address issues in public health, unemployment, housing, etc. So, some examples of progressive era reforms include antitrust laws like the Sherman Act of 1890 and the Clayton Act of 1914, which sought to break up monopolies and ensure fair competition in the market. You saw the regulation of food quality for roughly the first time, labor regulations setting minimum wages, setting reasonable working hours. This is around the period where we get the concept of the 8-hour working day, the 40-hour working week. You also saw the improvement of urban sanitation and public health. So it was kind of simultaneously both a bad time and a good time to live in a city like New York, because on the one hand, this was a period that saw a lot of urban unemployment and homelessness. On the other hand, things were improving very quickly. It was becoming much easier and more healthy to live in a city because of these reforms. Progressive era activists also, unfortunately, championed some causes that turned out to be either barbaric or wrong-headed, like eugenics, and the prohibition of alcoholic beverages. This is where we get, the prohibition laws that became such a big deal in the early part of the 20th century. The economic crisis also motivated the creation of many new charitable organizations for the poor and a growth in philanthropic endeavors by businessmen. So this includes the bread line at Fleischmann's Bakery, which was a real bakery. You could see an advertisement for it on the upper left. And the bread line was real. It was, in fact, documented both by Theodore Dreiser and by his fellow journalist and naturalist author, Stephen Crane. The extremity of the crisis also helped change some attitudes toward the poor. American class ideology, which we also kind of get from England, had long held that poverty was a moral condition and not just an economic one, that people were poor because of their character or their morals and not because of chance circumstances. This meant that it was normal for charities to scrutinize aid recipients to determine whether they were deserving of help. The depth of the 1893 crisis led some elites to change their minds and to begin to give indiscriminately rather than trying to separate the undeserving from the deserving. When Joseph Pulitzer's New York World established a free bread fund as both a charitable effort and as an advertising blitz, it gave direct food assistance to the poor, saying that you are hungry is credential enough. So, in the same vein, this is a picture of a stand offering free milk for babies, a project that was established by Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, the wife of Joseph Pulitzer's great competitor. So, in fact, newspapers and journalists would play a very significant role in informing the public about the plight of the poor, encouraging readers to show charity, and criticizing both an unresponsive government and corporations that took advantage of the public. Journalists were very much a part of this progressive era ethos. So it was reporting by a woman named Nellie Bly that led to reforms in the administration of insane asylums. Ida Tarbell's reporting on Rockefeller and Standard Oil would lead to the breakup of the oil trust and new anti-monopoly regulations. Ida B. Wells's reporting on lynching in the South raised awareness of the brutalities of the Jim Crow regime in the former Confederacy, and we're actually going to talk about this in more detail in a couple of weeks. And Upton Sinclair's novel, which was based on his own reporting on what happened in sausage plants, led to new food safety regulations. In short, journalism in this era achieved a new level of respect and a new social purpose. We ought to understand Sister Carrie, therefore, as part of this trend in the late 19th century that blended journalism with social activism and literature. Historian Michael Shudson actually argues that the figure of the reporter was actually a social invention of the 1880s and the 1890s. Before this point, we really didn't have such a person. So prior to this point, newspapers were often written, edited, and published by a single person. It wasn't until the growth of big city newspapers that editor publishers began to hiring a staff of writers to provide content. Under the old model, a correspondent was quite literally just that. To correspond means to exchange letters. And a correspondent would be somebody, say a friend of the editor or a family member or just somebody who was writing letters back to their hometown, informing everybody about what was going on in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. So the idea of a foreign correspondent would just literally be some local person who had traveled off to a foreign country either on vacation or as an expatriate, and was writing letters back to their hometown newspaper, um, to tell them what was happening in other countries. That was what a foreign correspondent was. It was essentially an amateur kind of thing. It was only at the end of the 19th century that journalism became a genuine profession, one that was taken up by college graduates, who could develop reputations, independent even from the newspapers they wrote for. So, as the education level, income, and status of the reporter developed, so too did their professional values, standards, and literary ambitions. In these decades, it became possible to become famous as a journalist, as did the individuals I mentioned earlier. What's more, it became possible to use journalism as a jumping off point for a literary career, which was precisely the path taken by many of the most prominent authors of the period, not only Dreiser, but Frank Norris, Upton Sinclair, who I mentioned earlier, Jack London, Stephen Crane, Ambrose Bierce, and eventually Ernest Hemingway and guys like that. Journalists who became novelists. The ideals of city journalists were both literary and social. They believed strongly that reporting should be rooted in the facts, but also that newspapers had to be lively, colorful, and entertaining. There's always a little bit of a tension in this era between this commitment to the facts and this desire to be entertaining, to tell good stories. Um, these reporters saw themselves, consistent with the progressive era, as like scientists uncovering economic and political facts of industrial life. But they were also doing it, more boldly, clearly, and realistically than anyone had done before. So, as such, they were influenced, like I said, by some of the same trends as progressive era reformers who were seeking to bring scientific knowledge to the remediation of social problems and improving human life, especially in big cities. It should also be noted that this scientific mindedness, this idea of being a scientific observer and using data, to using the facts to construct an overall portrait of humanity. This is not the same thing as what we now think of as objectivity. As Shudson notes, objectivity is a concept that involves the distrust of the self, recognizing your own biases and seeking to overcome or compensate for them in some way. Um, Late 19th century writers didn't really think about this. That would be, more or less a kind of, artifact of the period after the First World War. It wasn't until then that the study of psychology and, other fields had reached the point where people began sort of distrusting the evidence of their own eyes so much. These reporters rather saw themselves as rigorous observers of human behavior. They sort of felt like what they saw was, reality, and that they were capable of simply conveying that reality to their readers. They saw themselves as capable of describing the facts they gathered in vivid and interesting ways, and thereby revealing something about human nature. The truth that they felt that they reported was inevitably somewhat dark. Shudson says that reporters were united in opposing moralism, sham, and hypocrisy. They thought little of clergymen, political orators, reform efforts to close saloons and brothels, and editorial writers. Reporters felt a close emotional bond to their hard driving editors and as well to the tough and gritty men, both police and criminals, they got to know on the police detail. They felt close to the cynical and shrewd businessmen and politicians they interviewed and exposed. They struck a pose and saluted an ethic in which non belief was their pride. Dreiser summed up this posture of negatives. One can always talk to a newspaper man, I think, with the full confidence that one is talking to a man who is at least free of moralistic mush. So Dreiser is in some ways both a kind of a paradigmatic reporter of this era, a paradigmatic journalist, reflecting both, kind of the style of representing, human life in a big city, and also in terms of his overall attitude about human nature. So the outlook of the journalist was informed by what he saw on the urban beat and also by these other journalists. And this outlook tended to be cynical. They assumed that what they saw the world at, they assumed, excuse me, sorry, they assumed that they saw the world as it was, and that this world was Darwinian and unforgiving, and that man is but the plaything of fortune. Journalists mistrusted the views of editorial writers and religionists, not because they weren't objective, but because they were idealistic. So they tended to equate their own cynicism with realism. These conclusions were simply the natural ones, the rational ones that you would arrive at based on the data that they had gathered. So now that you've learned a little bit about where Dreiser's point of view comes from, and now that you have hopefully finished the novel, I'd like you to reflect both on it and on some of the big questions that this course as a whole is looking to answer. What does Sister Carrie tell us about cities? You can think of this question both in terms of what Dreiser intends to tell us and what he, perhaps unconsciously, reveals either about himself or about this period. And how does his experience as a journalist during this time likely influence all of this? I look forward to talking about this more in the online discussion forum.